All right, guys, here we are, chapter 13, urban patterns. We have like 14 slides to get through, which might be a lot. Hopefully not too long though. We will go fast, and please, if you have questions, write them down and we'll go over them in class, okay? Chapter 13, urban patterns. When we think about urban, you should automatically think city, okay? And all of the different components that go into having a city. We're going to cover what those components look like today and how they're organized. All right, moving right along. So starting with terms. City or town, you guys know what that is, a cluster of people in a nucleated settlement. City contains a central business district, or CBD, as well as residential, government, commercial, and industrial sectors. Cities perform functions and interact with the region around them. Their location is often politically, economically, and or socially strategic, right? That's that site and situation thing we talked about before. Conurbation is also known as a megalopolis. I like megalopolis better because I think it's a fun word to say, but conurbation is a synonym. It's a series of cities that have grown into one urban area over time. The one megalopolis, well, I guess we have two in the United States. The first one, the one that is most often referred to, is the megalopolis that exists from Boston, Massachusetts, down the I-95 corridor, all the way to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is just kind of on northwest Virginia, all the way up to Massachusetts. It's basically one series of cities. You go from D.C. to Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York to Boston over the course of like 300 miles, but it's really just one big city. The other one that we have in the United States is from like northern LA down to San Diego. Again, one big city. A similar one that might make sense to you guys a little bit better is if we go from, like if we were to drive from Ogden down to Provo, it's hard to see where the delineation is from one city to the next because it seems like it's all just one big city. That's kind of the idea of a conurbation or a megalopolis, except along our Wasatch Front from Ogden to Provo, not nearly as many people as what you're going to find in the I-95 one on the East Coast or between LA and San Diego. And then a suburb, you guys have probably heard that term before, but you may or may not know what it means. A suburb is a residential, industrial, or commercial specialized area of a city that's reliant upon other sectors of the city. It's not self-sufficient. So it's sort of like an add-on to the city. It's not really independent by itself. It still relies on the features and the services and availability of resources within the city, but it's sort of a little bit separate from it. The term, specifically suburb, basically means a sub or beneath, under, separate from urban, your urban center, right? Okay, next section of terms. Central city. We will refer to this often as the CBD, the Central Business District. It's an urban settlement that has been legally incorporated into an independent, self-governing unit known as a municipality. Basically, just the center of your city. The urban area is an area that consists of the central city and its surrounding built-up suburbs. So if we were to talk about the urban area of Salt Lake, it goes well beyond the borders of just Salt Lake City. And then the metropolitan area goes even further, an area in which economic and cultural influence from an urban area is felt. So if we were to look at the breakdown of Utah, our central city would be Salt Lake. The urban area would probably go from, I would say, North Salt Lake to, probably the hospital, probably Murray, along I-15, but the metropolitan area is basically the entire Salt Lake Valley. We all interact and are influenced by what happens in Salt Lake and what's available in Salt Lake. And so the metropolitan area is going to be far west, far east, north and south, basically the entire city, okay? I often think of this as the commuter zone. Sometimes the commuter zone extends even further. But if you're commuting from an area into Salt Lake City, you probably live within the metropolitan area. If you're too much further out, you generally were going to find another job where you don't have to drive as much. Moving on. Downtown is where you have the central business district. This is your central city. The center of your central city is your CBD, Central Business District. The Central Business District contains a large percentage of the public workings. So that would be like City Hall, the courthouse, as well as business, banking, journalism, finance, law, advertising, those kinds of things. And consumer services, retail, that's where the mall is, restaurants, bars, clubs, playhouses, that kind of thing. The Central Business District always has high accessibility. That's where you're going to find things like buses, and we have Front Runner and tracks, right? Others are going to have like a subway system where it all goes into and through the Central Business District. It's the focal point for the region's transportation network. It's often part of or near the original site of settlement, which is the case for our city that's closest to Salt Lake. It's generally close to water or water source, which started as an original transportation route. There is very little manufacturing, if any. Manufacturing is going to be like your factories, warehouses, that kind of stuff. That happens somewhere else. Because and we'll talk about this when we get to bid rent theory, but the land in the Central Business District, land is expensive, and manufacturing costs or requires lots of land, which means you can't afford to manufacture downtown because the land is too expensive for them to have the amount that they need in order to make manufacturing profitable. There also tends to be a lack of residents. Very few people actually live in the Central Business District, hence the name business, right? It's not generally for residences. However, there's been a trend recently, and by recently I mean probably the last 20 to 30 years, something called gentrification has been happening, where they're actually going into central business districts and central cities and fixing up any of the housing and apartment complexes that were originally there that have kind of fallen on hard times or have been shuttered. In some cases, they're taking old factories and repurposing them into like downtown condos and lofts, that kind of deal. But basically what gentrification is taking something that is sort of old and run down, fixing it up, rebranding it, and selling it to a new group of people who would be more interested in living in the Central Business District. The other thing that you often are going to find in the CBD is vertical space, both above ground and below ground. This is where you're going to find your skyscrapers. It's also where you're going to find your underground parking garages, okay? It goes from, vertical, up and down, much more so than side to side. If you think about a skyscraper, you look at the kind of the background of this slide, the actual footprint of the building is going to be much, much smaller than the space that the building occupies vertically, right? There's much more vertical space than there is horizontal space. Again, because The horizontal space in the central business district is so expensive, and it's such a premium that you need to make the most out of going up instead of going out. Okay, with that understanding of the central business district, we are ready to talk about models. Now, there are a series of different models that have been put together to try to explain the way cities have organized themselves. We're going to go through a few of them. These are the models that are going to be part of the different sets that you can get in our spoons game, okay? Models are specifically to help us explain and determine urban structure and development, and where different types of people live in an urban area. We talk about urbanization, right? People moving from the country into the city. But if they don't live in the central business district, where do they live? And how does that work? So the models are created to help us identify and explain that. So the first model was put together by a guy named Burgess in 1923, and it is titled the concentric zone model. It basically looks like a target, right? What the concentric zone model says is that a city grows outward. Okay, so we start in the middle and we go out into a series of concentric rings. The width and size of the rings vary from city to city, but the same basic rings tend to appear in every city in the same order, okay? The 5 basic rings are Central Business District in the middle. Right outside the Central Business District, you have the Zone of Transition, which is where you're going to find industry, okay? This is your manufacturing, there we go. And it's also where you're going to find poor housing. So this is what we would call the ghetto, if you will, or slums. Outside of that zone of transition, you have the zone of working class homes. That's the orange. Then outside the orange, you have the zone of better residences, which is more of your middle class. That's the brown. And then the last one is the commuter zone. That's the green. A little further out, land is cheaper. You can have bigger yards. You can get bigger houses than you can afford closer to the city. And so people are willing to live a little further out because they feel like they get more for their money. Now, a question that I often get is, if people don't live in the central business district, but they want to be close to it, why is the zone of transition poor housing? Why is this purple area considered poor housing, or considered the slums or the ghetto? The reason is when the central business district was originally established, that's where the original settlement usually is or was. And people originally settled right outside of that. As the city expands, those people move further out. And what's left is what they originally occupied, which tends to, get run down. It isn't well maintained. And so it becomes this poor housing piece. Now, this area is also the area that is experiencing that concept of gentrification, where they're coming in and they're actually taking all of that housing that was original to the settlement, hundreds of years ago in some cases, fixing it up, reselling it, making it nice, adding in some money for some new development of, restaurants and shops and other things to make that a desirable place to live again. There's some issues to gentrification, which we'll get to later. But when we talk about it, that is the zone of gentrification that we're usually referring to. Okay, so this is your concentric zone model. It looks like a target. It's the original. And from there, everything is sort of a different version. So the next one is the sector model. The sector model says that a city grows and develops in a series of sectors. Certain areas of the city, especially depending on where the city is located, are more attractive for various activities. As the city grows, activities expand outward in a wedge or a sector, okay, from the center. There are 5 sectors, which look a lot like the concentric zone rings. The first is the central business district. Notice it's still in the middle. The second is transportation and industry. That is your purple. Okay, transportation and industry. The third is low-class residential. That's your orange. So the purple is where you're going to find your manufacturing. The orange is where you're going to find your ghetto type areas, also where gentrification happens. The brown is your middle class, and then your high class residential is this sector of green. You'll notice the example is Chicago. What happens is, because Chicago is built on the lake, there are certain areas that are more desirable, that people want to live. And so this high-class residential sector right here is lakefront property. And so you're going to find that much more common if there are certain geographic features that people want to be closer to. That is sort of an indicator that that city could be following the sector model. The multiple nuclei model, there's a picture on the next slide. But the multiple nuclei model essentially says that a city is a complex structure that includes more than one center around which activities revolve. Examples could include a port, neighborhood business center, a university, an airport, park, other kind of big attraction type things. A university attracts bookstores and pizzerias, whereas an airport attracts hotels and warehouses. So the picture looks like this, where you kind of have your typical central business district, but then you kind of have these other little nodes that pop up, or nucleuses that pop up. So wholesale light manufacturing is purple. Low class residential, which is where your gentrification happens, is going to be your orange. Medium class residential, or your middle class, is your brown. Heavy manufacturing is this green. Is that right? No, 5 is high class residential. That's your green. Heavy manufacturing is 6, which is down here. This is where you would find like a port or a certain economic, like a lumber yard or a steel mill, something like that. Outlying business districts would be 7. Where's 7? Oh, right here. Between middle class residential and high class residential, you can have another kind of secondary central business district. Residential suburbs here, industrial suburbs here. So you kind of have different things popping up as the city expands and new things are introduced. Okay. So this is multiple nuclei. Galactic. Galactic city model and peripheral city model are synonyms. They are the same thing. They mean the same thing. You could potentially see either come up, so just know that they're the same and understand what that means. So this model takes into account changes in the urban form that have taken place since World War II. Notice all of the other 3 models, the 3 main ones, the sector model, the concentric zone, and the multiple nuclei, they all happened early in the development of cities in our country. After World War II, with this kind of boost of economic stability and manufacturing kind of comes into its own, that changes cities and influences where things are built and how people relate to where those things are. And so the galactic and peripheral city model is sort of the answer to those changes. specifically looking at suburbanization of things that were once central city functions. So you'll notice in the model, there's a belt that goes around the central city. So you still have your central city there in the middle, like always. But outside, there's this highway or this circle that circumnavigates the entire central city and almost offers like a transportation route for additional development to happen outside the central city. And so what you'll see is things like a shopping mall pop up. You can have an airport out there, shopping centers, employment centers, additional industrial districts. Other things pop up along that kind of belt route that encourages and allows for people to live further out because they can still get to things that they would normally have to go all the way into the city to do, but now they're available further out, okay? So galactic or peripheral city model, one thing you will always notice is that it has that peripheral belt that lies within the metropolitan area, but outside the central city itself. The suburbs then develop along that belt. Low density sprawl around suburban business centers. Residents live most of their lives in the periphery because everything that they need is now accessible outside the city center. They don't have to go all the way downtown to do things that they normally would have before. What happens as a result of this is something called edge, which is the next slide. So edge cities exist in the galactic and peripheral city model. And they were first identified fairly recently, right? 1991, 20 years ago. No, 30 years ago. 30 years ago. The example that I give is Tyson's Corner, Virginia. Now, you guys have probably never heard of Tyson's Corner, Virginia, but Tyson's Corner, Virginia was first identified by this guy, Joel Garreau, who noticed that with these galactic cities, you have this kind of phenomenon that happens that he calls edge cities. And Tyson's Corner fits all of the things we're going to go over of what an edge city is, okay? So he said that an element found in galactic or peripheral city, an edge city originated as a suburban residences for people who worked in the central business district. Okay, so living outside the central business district, still commuting into downtown. Then shopping malls were built and business services arrived, often found near major freeway interchanges. There are 5 rules for a place to be labeled as an edge city. There is more, and these rules are very specific, which is interesting because normally with geography, especially models, the more specific you are, the less helpful it can be. But edge cities follow a very specific set of guidelines. So there's more than 5 million square feet of office space, so which is your basic typical downtown. Okay, so lots and lots of place for business. There's over 600,000 square feet of retail space, which is like your typical mall size. Population rises every morning and drops every evening, which suggests that there's more jobs than there are residents. Okay, so people come into the area for work and then they leave the area to go home at the end of the day somewhere else. The place is a single end destination, which means it's somewhere that has it all. Okay, so if you want to go somewhere to do errands, this is somewhere you could go. You could go to the mall, you could go to the post office, you could get your grocery shopping done, you could go see a movie, you could go to dinner with your friends. It has it all. You can do all of those things here. And the area must not have been developed 30 years ago, so it has to be new. It pops up as an additional component of these galactic and peripheral city models. But it's sort of like going somewhere to do something, but people don't actually live there. Lots of business happens there, lots of economic activity happens there. You know, people go shopping, people go to work, People own businesses and, you know, have jobs and all of that kind of thing, but they don't actually live there. And there isn't really an option to live there. Residences don't really actually exist there. They're almost just these urban centers. Okay. Okay. With that, let's talk about bid rent. Bid rent theory plays a role specifically in the creation of edge cities, in the creation of so the suburbs and kind of the multiple nuclei pieces where you have these additional kind of city center option, secondary city centers popping up. It all comes back to this bid rent theory piece. So bid rent theory suggests that city structures are determined in part by land costs. Okay, so you'll notice in the graphic that so this, the y-axis, there we go, is, that says pounds. It could easily just also include dollars, right? Money, or the cost of rent per meter squared. And the x-axis is distance from the central business district. And so residential is way out here. Let me use a different color pen again. Let me erase that first. That one. And I'll use a different pen color. We'll use yellow. Okay, residential is way out here because that's not a pen, that's a highlighter, still there. Okay, there we go. Because it's expensive to live downtown and people want yards, they want, you know, a little bit of breathing room. They want to be able to let their dog play in the backyard and, you know, throw the ball around with their kid in the front yard. They want their kids to be able to ride their bikes in the street, all of that kind of thing. That can't happen in the central business district because space is limited and it's crowded, right? There's taxis and cars and people going hustle and bustle everywhere. And so the kind of space that people want to be able to live in is expensive. So you are likely to be further from the central business district. Okay. And the further out you are, the lower your cost is. Manufacturing is somewhere in the middle. And we'll talk more about manufacturing in our next unit when we talk about industrialization. But the basics of manufacturing is we need to be close to the central business district. Okay, so it's certainly closer than what you find with residential. We need to be close to the central business district, but we can't be too close because manufacturing requires a lot of space, and space in the central business district is expensive, and we can't afford that. But we need to be close because that's where our market is. So we need to be able to get all of the things we're manufacturing to the people who are going to buy them in the central business district. So that's the one that kind of splits the difference. It's not all the way far out, like what you find with residential, but it's also not all the way downtown because it's too expensive to buy the amount of land they need in order to manufacture anything. What you do find downtown, more likely, is retail. Retail doesn't require as much space, right? A storefront, you can have a couple hundred square feet and still make a pretty decent profit. And so also with retail, you want to be downtown where all of the people are and business and economics activity happens. So you want to be in the central business district. That's where you're going to make your money. That's where business happens. And so you need to be downtown. But you also, obviously, have to weigh the cost of what it's going to actually, you know, cost in order for you to have a store downtown. And so the stores you find downtown often tend to be very small, or they tend to be vertical, right? Where you have a small footprint, but you go up. Hopefully this makes sense and you guys can better understand where things are located and why they're located there. Over here, the price and demand for land changes as it gets further away from the market. It's all about maximizing profits, right? We're always looking to make as much money as possible with our given set of circumstances. Being closer to the market increases the potential for more customers. There's a trade-off between accessibility and cost. All right, and the last thing for today is these limitations or critiques of the models. None of the models can be taken individually completely. None of the models taken individually completely explains why different types of people live in distinctive parts of the city. It just doesn't. It's simply there as a guide to help offer understanding for why things are located where they are. But models in general, because they're simply guides or tools, they're often too simple, okay? And they fail to consider the variety of reasons that lead people to select particular residential locations. For example, in Utah, maybe if you're a skier, you want to be closer to a canyon where you can actually access the ski resorts more easily, as opposed to, out here on the west side where I don't really ski very often, and so because I don't really need that same accessibility. But those types of sort of exceptions to the rule or specific features of the area aren't explained or aren't even really addressed or considered within these models. There's always more to the story, right? Again, the models simply provide a tool to help explain, but they're never going to give us all the answers. The original three models, specifically concentric zone, sector, and multiple nuclei, were all based on conditions in years between World War I and World War II. They all happened in between I think concentric zone started in 1923, and the multiple nuclei model came out not too long before World War I started. And so obviously a lot has changed since then. And so it's not super relevant to contemporary urban patterns, which is why we still see new models being created and sort of tacked on to the older models. When you have multiple nuclei, the kind of newer version is this the galactic city model with edge cities thrown in there, right? Models tend to be more helpful when they're combined. If we can look at things in conjunction with multiple models, they tend to make a little bit more sense. We can see different aspects from each model appear in lots of cities across the country. The other thing that's a limitation that isn't on here, but it's that these models were specifically developed in the US and specifically applied to the US and developed countries. Okay, if we try to apply them to developing countries, or even some countries that are developed that aren't the US, they don't necessarily fit quite as well. And so that would be an additional limitation, that it just applies specifically to the United States. Okay, that's it for today. There's 3 more models that we'll go over in class on Tuesday. Well, actually 4 more models that we'll go over in class on Tuesday, and then we'll play spoons. The 4 models we're going to go over on Tuesday are specific regional models. There's Europe, there's Southeast Asia, there's Africa, and there's Latin America. And they apply better in those regions as opposed to using these three, to try to apply them to those developing regions. So with that, we will be done for the day. I obviously, if you're watching this, it's because I posted it in Canvas. I think there will probably be some sort of quick assignment for you to do just to make sure you kind of understand and conceptualize what we've gone over. Again, if you have questions, please make sure you notate what they are so we can go over them in class. Okay, I will see you guys on Tuesday. Have a great weekend.